Hi everyone, I'm Rob James. I'm the Group Chief Digital and Information Officer for TPG Telecom. I'm here to talk to you a little bit about telco architecture and thinking about how to reimagine it for a modern and digital world. But maybe a little bit about who TPG Telecom are. You may or may not have heard of us. We're actually a merger that occurred last year in the middle of the global pandemic. It was a merger between two organisations, Vodafone Hutchison Australia, which was a joint venture between Vodafone UK and Hutchison in Asia, and TPG Telecom, an Australian-born telco. Both been around for about 20 years. Now, both organisations had very unique offerings. One in the sense that Vodafone in Australia had a very strong, or Vodafone Hutchison in Australia had a very strong mobile network, third largest in Australia, whereas TPG Corporation was actually a fixed line provider, fixed network provider. Now coming together, we're the second largest telco in Australia. We have the third largest mobile network plus the second largest, the largest fixed line network in Australia. We provide both fixed line services and mobile services to our customers. We represent a whole bunch of brands: Vodafone, TPG, Internet, iiNet, AAPT, and a new brand, Felix. These are well-known and trusted brands across Australia that have been around for many, many years. So it's been certainly an enjoyable ride to be part of this merger. But the story I want to talk to you about is when we came together as a merged organization, how we think about the transformation of our technology, our operating model, our culture, and more importantly, when we think about the technology aspects of it, it's how we think about of our technology architecture in the new paradigms that are being shared with us across many other organizations. So it is really a story about change and transformation. And like any change, regardless if it's in a technology change or if a change in your own personal life, trying to stop smoking or reduce your weight, without the struggle, there is no progress. And that's really important. That's something that I keep talking to everyone about in our organization, that as we go through this change, there will be some suffering, there will be some tough times, but there's benefits at the other end of it. So what am I talking about when I'm talking about the change? Because I'm talking about three dimensions to this, and they're all critically important to understand how they all interplay together. So let me first talk about what they are. So first of all, there's the technology transformation, and that's the one that I'll be spending the most time talking about today. But the technology transformation is probably the most straightforward and least controversial. What I mean by that is that if you've got a whole bunch of architects in a room to debate this, they will probably land on the same page. And that is, we need to simplify our technology. We want to be microservice driven. We want to expose everything through APIs. You know, absolutely, we want to be event driven. We want to capture the events, whether they're customer or business events occurring in our organization. And we want to make sure that we have a true strategy around how we partner and how we source our workforce around it. So it's not the easiest by any means, but it certainly would be the most straightforward when you think about what it looks like. Then we get into the operating model. And what I mean by the operating model, this is everything from the way we work to how we actually use the technology to how the people interact with each other. And you see there that I say it is the most difficult. Why is it the most difficult? Because you are changing people. You're changing the way they work in their day-to-day, their teams, the people they interact with. And people are, humans are the creatures of habit. They don't like change. So this is actually the most challenging, most difficult, and really does take a lot of time to get right. But what you're after here is, empowering teams, making sure they're autonomous, making sure they're cross-disciplinary, cross-functional and multidisciplinary. We want to make sure that we're embedding the whole end-to-end life cycle in these squads or teams so that they can use the technology, this new architecture, to deliver better outcomes for the business. And the final dimension here is the cultural of the organization. And you'll see this come into play shortly, but I believe this is the most important one, because without this, no matter how much you change the technology or the way people work, you will fail. You really need to think about how the culture of the organization, who you want to be. Do you want to be focused on delivering value very quickly to your customer? Do you want to be able to roll out small incremental changes, or are they big bang changes? Are we in an environment where we want to innovate and experiment? Do we think about the customer or do we think about the shareholder? These are really, really important questions that need to be answered when you think about the cultural transformation of the organization. But as I said earlier, these three actually interplay in a very special way. And this drives much of that strategy that I was talking about. Now, this is a very esoteric relationship, so it's probably best described through a few examples. So if we think about what I mentioned earlier about being an organization that wants to innovate, that you want to experiment. Well, if you have technology that is myopic, it's complex, convoluted, and you have outsourced that to third parties, everything's managed through a contract. How do you expect to innovate on technologies like that? You have to rely heavily on your vendors, your suppliers. You'd have to have a very, very slow cycle of innovation as you make incremental changes on very large, complex systems. The same is true for the operating model. If you've got that all outsourced, how do you expect to innovate with only your partners? How do they understand your business without you bringing them very, very close to your business? But what about in the instance where you have a siloed organization? If you're structured in such a way that before the business can engage with IT, they write a really extensive requirements document, and that gets handed over IT to deliver a specification and a quote. And even IT might be fragmented in its own right. And that is that, you know, there might be one team that writes the business requirements that then sends it to an outsourcer to actually pull together the estimates and quotes, and then another outsourcer that does the implementation, and yet another that takes on the actual operations of the platform. And finally, that might come back to a sales and marketing team who are only responsible for selling this product and not actually getting the feedback on it. So in such a very siloed organization, you can't expect to actually be aligned to the customer, you know, what the customer wants, because you're thinking about what each of those outcomes are through those stages of the life cycle of developing something. So this is something that we really need to consider very seriously about what technology we choose that allows us to support an operating model we want to have. So if we want to have a operating model where we heavily innovate and we want to change and we want to disrupt, we need to make sure that we have technology in place, excuse me, technology in place that allows us to build small components and do them rapidly and make mistakes and fix those mistakes. And we also need a culture that allows us to make mistakes and accepts from those learnings and to pivot on those. So it's really important that we understand how these things are related. But first, let's think a little bit more about what are we actually transforming? So let's think about it in the context of a traditional organization or a traditional IT department. First of all, we need to support our people at work. So, you know, traditionally people come into the office, we provide them with a working environment on a secure network, with the tools that they need to actually do their job. The marketing and analytics teams, they use the data that we've captured through the history of running our organization to build campaigns, market to our customers, measure the performance, make adjustments on that, and re-campaign to those customers to then move on to the sales and distribution channels, who then are fairly traditional in an old world. There might be retail, call centers, other channels, and we think about how do we actually sell the product or the service to that customer. And we also need to think about how do we manage that product or service in the inherent supply chain that manufactures it, so we've got enough stock or enough capacity to provide that to the customer. But guess what? That is not the world we live in anymore. And our whole IT ecosystem has been disrupted from that. So first of all, something that we're all being part of at the moment is, in a post-pandemic world, we're not going into the office like we used to. Our workers are not walking into a working environment that is controlled on a controlled network. They're working from everywhere on anything. They're working from home or cafes on open internet links. They're working on varied hours of the day on mobile devices, and we need to be able to support that kind of ecosystem. Online marketing is much different now. It's not about capturing data that we've historically been able to capture, but it's about real-time marketing. It's about what the customer is doing right now, being able to react on what the customer is doing right now through personalized next best type action decisioning. Gone are the days where we can actually market to the customer and then review what the results were a couple of days later, adjust and get back to that customer. In this new world, the customer's already made a decision and purchased, and we have lost them. And sales channels, they've changed significantly. We don't have traditional sales channels. They come through various different angles, and there's aggregation of sales. And we have to think about how do we get to those customers that want to be sold to in their own time and in their own space. And we need the technology to support that. And finally, our ecosystem of logistics and operations needs to be totally optimized. It needs to be just in time, and we need to make decisions about stock levels or where they exist in our ecosystem in a real-time world. As you can see from particularly this new world that I'm talking about, it's going to lead into what we're going to talk about in a minute, which is how do you capture these real-time events and real-time data points to make these decisions on better marketing, better sales, and better manufacturing for our people, and better distribution operations for our people. Essentially, what I'm talking about here is a nervous system for our business. So the events and data become the actual business's nervous system. These are the pulses that are going throughout our organization, where we make decisions that allow things to function, that manufacture, that react. Without these kind of these sensors, without these pulses, the organism that is our business will be extremely restricted, or worst case possible in this modern world, will actually totally die. Okay, so let's talk about our first topic here, which is around technology transformation. So this is at the heart of where we want to start, of what we're actually transforming. Now, the first picture I want to show you is quite an ugly one. So this probably is not unlike what many organizations that have been established over many years, buying lots of technology and building much technology, end up in their world. So this is actually actual architectural diagrams of one of the brands that we look after and one of the telco stacks that I look after at TPG Telecom. And as you can tell, it is a plethora of systems with spaghetti connecting them all. And although we thought this was from a time of old, this still exists today, and it's something that we have to deal with today. So what kind of problems are we actually dealing with? So at a very, very high level, we probably have duplicate systems that are providing very similar capabilities for either our workforce or our customers. Now, the problem with this is that we have duplicate systems creating duplicate data and also duplicate costs, but it's also complicating downstream decisioning, and it's also slowing us down whenever we want to make a change. As an example, when I talk about within TPG Telecom, we have multiple telco stacks. So if we want to deliver one particular product across all our brands, we have to actually do it many times at the moment, and hence why this transformation is actually really critical for us. Beyond the duplicate systems, we have fragmentation of systems. So we typically go out and purchase technologies, off-the-shelf technologies, and maybe only use 50, 60% of the capabilities, or even worse than that. Sometimes we buy some really complex platforms to only use 10% of the capabilities on there. Why? Because we really like what that 10% can do, but we're actually paying a premium for that. So we're actually using very tactical solutions or very strategic systems for tactical solutions. Again, this is increasing our complexity and also increasing the cost of what we're doing. Now, with all this fragmentation and duplication, what inherently happens is data becomes fragmented. You know, this whole concept of single view of customer or 360-degree view of customer, as one example, becomes the holy grail of every organization, because data is everywhere, and it's very, very hard to bring the data together, to cleanse it, to normalize it, to actually understand what is going on with the data. So we have very complex ecosystems around data lakes and warehouses and marts, and how we actually apply real-time data to that. And that becomes a bit of a rod for our own back as we're trying to make decisions on data that inevitably becomes quite old as we wait for the data to reach the persistent layers to be able to make those decisions. The other thing is once we have all these systems and they're within our whole ecosystem that runs our business, how do we bring it all together? Now, in the world that we've come from, whether it's service-oriented architectures, ESBs, whether it's point-to-point, we probably have a lot or many of these different implementations today. But that leads to much more complication as well, and a lot of maintenance costs sitting on top of that as we look after these systems and operate them. There's very, there's particularly, if I think about, again, TPG Telecom, we still have file transfer as an integration technology. And this is certainly a slow and archaic way of doing things. And then finally, even if we try and solve a lot of these problems, we may go out there and buy some very big, expensive, monolithic systems that try and be the silver bullet for everything. So ERPs have often been the case for that. And what we find is that unless you implement the ERP as it is vanilla out of the box, there's a lot of cost and complexity on implementation of that ERP. But the flip side of that is if you just implement it out of the box, you become a cookie cutter business with absolutely no differentiation. Now, ERP, you can get away with it, and you'll see me talk about that in a minute, because ERP, it probably very little differentiation from you to your competitors, except for through maybe some of the capabilities where you could extract it out of the ERP. But sometimes we build these or purchase these systems as our digital platforms or as our customer facing systems, and that becomes quite a hindrance for us. So if this is the world we're coming from, let's talk a little bit about the world that we need to go to. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this slide, and although it somewhat looks complex, it actually brings everything together in the sense of what the architecture needs to look like, how the operating model needs to support that, and how that is going to help with your cultural transformation. So if we just step through this is really talking about how the systems, the architecture, and the operating model come together. And if we start with the little man there at position number 1, we're talking about customers, we're talking about our workforce, we're actually talking about any kind of business activities, creating events. So these events are the events as we think about them, business events, customer events, that are essentially capturing a pulse of data, so a packet of data that is happening at a point in time. In an event-driven architecture, what we want to do is capture these events, and we want to put them on a pipeline of sorts. And I like to call this our data pipeline, which is our nervous system. So this is basically the real-time data flowing through the nervous system, the packets of data that we can do things with. Now, ultimately, it'll sit, it needs to be persisted somewhere. So you can see we're calling out that we have a data lake on the right-hand side. This is where our packets of data, unprocessed, can sit in the lake, and we can do something with them afterwards. We can run some analytics, we can make further decisions, but the data never disappears. It does exist through not only our through our pipeline of data in our nervous system, but through a memory retention place, which is our persistent storage. How do we get to this data and these packets of data, and the information is through an API integration layer. So many of the things that you're probably going to be hearing about or heard about is through the use of microservices and very atomic APIs. We're able to capture this data, we're listening for this data, and we can connect it into our systems. Now, the point there highlighted by number 5 is the critical one, because this is the interlock between our data stream and our technology architecture and how it connects into our operating model. And so in this instance here, we are connecting our operating model to one that is customer centric. And as you can see there, we are talking about a customer journey lifecycle from the left-hand side, which talks about the discovery, right through to the customer loyalty on the right-hand side. So let me talk a little bit about this, because this is actually really, really important when you think about how the technology architecture overlays with your operating model. So in this instance here, the discover phase of the customer journey is when a customer gets to understand who the brand is, what the products are, and how, whether they can actually relate to them. So this is the point where a customer, this point ends when a customer walks into a store, clicks onto your website, or calls the call center or something similar. Now, in the diagram there, you can see that there's these colored boxes underneath. These are the components, the technology capabilities and services that allow you to provide this discover phase for your customer. And I'll talk about that more in my next slide. But let's just go through the actual phases of the customer journey here so you understand what they are. The second phase there is the buy phase. So this is once the customer's walked into the store, how do we convert them into actually walking out with a product or a service? Again, we need systems that will support that. They're purchasing systems, they might be credit check systems, they might be our digital services that enable that. So there's a whole bunch of systems that are supported by platforms that allow the buy phase of the customer journey. Once our customers bought our product or service, we get to the use phase. And the use phase starts with the startup process, provisioning the service, provisioning a number, configuring your account, right through to recharging, to if we're talking about a mobile phone service or a subscription to one of our broadband services, the purchasing and recharging or repurchasing of those products. What are those systems that sit underneath? So they're the billing systems, they're the payment systems, et cetera, et cetera. Then we get into the support stage. And the support stage is really important as well. So if our customer has any issues with us in the support stage, they're able to be they're able to resolve that. Now, in a event-driven architecture, this becomes really interesting because you're starting to capture information in real time. That support starts to become proactive rather than reactive. So imagine a world where a customer has had a couple of credit checks failed. They may want to call us. But in a real-world event, real-time event-driven architecture, we already know that they've had a couple of failed credit checks, and we may be able to proactively contact them to notify them that although that they haven't actually had a credit check fail, they've had a reduction on what their limit is, and so therefore they can still purchase a device, but it needs to be a lower cost one. Or it could be that we can see that their data packets on their broadband service are not the pattern that we normally see. We see less data that is flowing through the broadband service. We can proactively do line checks. We can check that as far as we're concerned, the service is up and operational for them. But then we can contact them and say, look, we suspect there might be an issue with their internal Wi-Fi network because we know that they're having data problems, but we can see that all our services are working as they've been checked. So it really flips the model for support there. Now, finally, the loyalty phase is an interesting one because in a telco world, this is something that is not thought about a lot. And if we think about a mobile phone service or a mobile phone contract, many customers, they might buy a 24-month contract and they'll never hear from us. Or the only time we hear from them is when they pick up the phone when they have a problem. And they won't hear from us unless we get to month 21 of their 24-month contract, where we're asking them to extend their contract for another 2 years. So there is no loyalty here. We're basically just coming back to them when we want them to purchase more services from us. So loyalty is making sure that we are interacting with the customer as the customer wants through the whole life cycle of the journey, through the duration of the contract with us, during any touch points that they have with us, to make sure that they become loyal customers so that the month 21 conversation doesn't even need to exist. They will continue to provision services or extend services with us. So now that I spent a bit of time on what the customer journey is all about, I'm going to touch a little bit on the last three layers there, which talks about the platforms, but I'm going to get into more detail on that on my next slide because it's actually quite important. So when you think about your technology platforms, you want to divide them out into 3 layers. And these, so you've got your verticals that support your operating model, in this instance, a customer line, but the horizontals is the technology platforms on how they support the business. So first of all, we have our customer journey platforms. Now, quite intentionally, these are the systems that interact directly with the customer. Now, it doesn't mean that the customer interacts with these systems, it just means that the systems interact with the customer. So the obvious ones are things like our digital channel platforms, but it could also be the CRM platform that contains the customer data. It could be the way the customer interacts with our call center to make sure that we provide the service or the customer experience that they expect. Why do we want to differentiate these? Because we want to own the customer journey. We want to be the owners of our domain here, that we want to make sure these systems we manage, we maintain, we don't outsource them. They need to be lightweight, they need to be agile, they need to be nimble, we need to be able to change them quickly, they need to be customizable, we need to be able to provide the most optimal experience for our customer, because that's how our customer will interact with us. The second layer there is the business capability platforms. What are these? These are the systems that we need to run our business. Our customer doesn't particularly care about what systems we use here, but we do. We require billing systems, rating systems. We require the ERP I mentioned earlier, HR systems. So these are, they may not be differentiating within our organization. So the ERP we have or an ERP our competitor has makes no difference to the type of experience we give our customer. We may want to buy off the shelf here. We may want to consider monolithic systems. We may want to consider modular systems that are API enabled. That might make more sense in our ecosystem. We may want to outsource these systems as well. That's another option. So there's a strategy that we need to consider there. And then finally, we have the core technology platforms. What are these? These are the tech platforms that IT needs to support, maintain, and potentially develop, that is going to feed and water and enable the layers that exist above. So these are our data platforms, how we integrate, the cloud platforms we might use, how we support our business, how we do machine learning, et cetera, et cetera. So this slide here, I think, is a very important one to understand how you align all those dimensions of the technology with the actual operating model and ultimately the culture side of things. I'll just spend a little bit more time on the platforms because it's really important. So this is really just breaking out those three layers that we talked about a moment ago, but it's just talking about them in a way that you can understand them more of how they interplay with each other. And I'm going to start at the bottom here, which is our core IT platforms, the IT for IT. So these are the systems, like I said a moment ago, is how that we're going to build all the other systems upon. It's the data platform that we need. It's the cloud platform we need. It's how we're going to enable omni-channel within our ecosystem. It's also some of the lower order services that we might need within our environment, such as facial recognition. So we might use facial recognition to identify customers, but we might do the same thing to authenticate our users and our workforce as well. Once we have those platforms, they then help us build out the business capability platforms, or the company as a service, as we call it. So we might have things like ERP and HR, as I mentioned, but there are some key capabilities that sit within those platforms, such as being able to do a credit check, provisioning services into the network, how we handle payments, how we manage our inventory. That's all done within this layer. But as you notice, these are the capabilities that are important to us when we run our business, but they won't be important to our customer. That's when we get to the top layer there, which is the journeys as a service, the customer journey platforms. So this is how we build and modularize the experience for our customers. So it could be things like providing a click and collect service, how we provide a seamless account service for a customer where they can see all their details, the ability to purchase online and potentially complete transactions through IVR, the ability to have an in-store experience that is unique to us and not our competitors. So these platforms, we need to start thinking about how do we build the operating model around supporting these platforms. Now, before I go into talking about the operating model, the last box there to just briefly talk about is the mission control on the left-hand side. So this is really how we orchestrate everything coming together. This is there's two elements to this. There's the technology element, and that is how does data services flow between these systems, but there is the operating model aspect of it, and that is the mission control side of it provides that coordination, oversight, understands what the standards are, how everything's going to interact, and also understands how we provide or how we allocate resources. So do we invest more in the customer journey platforms right now, or are we at a stage where we're still building out our core IT platforms? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the operating model. And like I said earlier, the operating model is really probably the most difficult one because it involves people change. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I just, I wanted to focus more around the technology side of things, but I didn't want to just glance over this. So very, very quickly, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but I just wanted to show you how the operating model worked with those customer journeys that I was talking through earlier. So we've got slightly different labeling because it's a different version, but we still have discover, buy, activate. So we changed the use. We broke it up from activate, from use to startup or activate, and then use. And instead of support, we've bundled support into use, and loyalty is all about stay. Now you can see the core technology platforms there, but importantly, you can see how the teams have been established to support those platforms, to support those capabilities that sit within those customer journey tribes. And up the top there, you see the channels where we interact with our customer, and the capabilities on the right-hand side. So the capabilities are software engineering, brand and marketing, architecture, the kind of capabilities that we're going to build out in our organization to support the technology that we're going to invest in. Okay, so if we implement that kind of operating model, what are the important, principles to take away when you're implementing this? And there's kind of a lot of things to consider here, but I probably think that the first one is the most important: cross-functional, multidisciplinary, empowered, and autonomous teams. You want these teams, these squads, to be able to own an outcome from the imagination of that, or imagining that product or service or the change, right through to delivering it to the customer and improving it for the customer. We don't want to hand things over to other teams. We want them to be able to own it end to end. This is actually very difficult in a large organization, because in a larger organization, this becomes very, very complex to maintain. You want to flip away from KPIs, key performance indicators, and move towards objectives and key results. What we're talking about here is ambitious goals that are going to be qualitative in nature. They're a motivational tool, and they're oriented towards growth, not output. So this is a big change in how people behave. Funding models and governance at speed. So funding models, we're moving away from building business cases for a project or a product, but we're building business cases to establish teams that deliver an outcome. That team may look after one product, they may look after many products, they may develop a new product, but the intent is that team is funded to deliver an outcome, which ultimately means revenue and profit for the business, but also a customer experience outcome as well. And the other thing is, we can get caught up in governance, lots of different hoops that we need to jump through. So we need to think about how do we implement lean governance so we can actually do this all at speed. When we think about how we're going to develop our people, we have to think about the role definitions and their career development, because we flip things around. If I'm the leader of the discover phase, that's not something you can put an ad in the market, a general manager for discover. It's not functionally aligned. It's aligned to a customer outcome. So we still need to understand that there's a specialty that individual might need. So in the instance of discover, it might be that they're a data-driven individual, and we might be looking for someone that's traditionally a chief data officer that is going to be inclined towards customer outcomes. The last thing there is the project to product. So I've already talked about that, but we want to shift that. Now, why is that important? That's because projects have an end date. They finish at some point in time. Products don't. You keep delivering products right through to until they die or you retire them. So that's very important to note. So just a couple of the last things to leave you with. I really love this quote when trying to motivate or establish what we're trying to do within our teams. If you want to build a ship, don't draw up the men together wood, divide the work and give orders. Instead, teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea. This is all about the motivation of establishing those teams. So let's talk a little bit about the cultural transformation, and I'll then leave it with you to think about how this all comes together. So there's really 3 key pillars to your cultural transformation. I've already touched on this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. Remove those functional silos. We want to remove the need to hand over between teams. I talked about the first principle in our operating model is to make sure we empower teams to be autonomous and end-to-end. That's exactly what this is about. We don't think about functions, we think of delivering a business outcome. Encouraging experimentation and innovation. Now, one thing I often talk about is I hate the idea, and we've been talking about it for years, of failing fast. I don't think I would ever get any money if I go to my CFO and say, I need a couple of $1 million to go away and fail. What you're actually doing is learning. We want to be able to learn fast. We want to be able to adjust. We want to be able to change our mind. We want to be able to improve. So we want to be able to do that through experimentation. And the important thing here is that we want to solve a problem in a way that it's not been solved before. And that's what the operating model is really supporting, as well as the technology. If we have big monolithic systems, all we're doing is solving a problem the way it's been solved hundreds, if not thousands of times before. And I love this little quote, I think it's from Albert Einstein, which is, innovation is seeing what everybody has seen and thinking what nobody has thought. So definitely has to be part of the cultural aspects of the business. And being customer obsessed, we hear this a lot, customer ahead of profits. Let's not think about EBITDA and NPAT. Let's think about net promoter score, voice of the customer, customer satisfaction scores, and customer effort score. If you don't know what any of these things are, definitely get yourself versed on those. And I'm specifically talking to you about this if you're a technical person, if you're an architect, a developer, an executive, a technical executive, you need to start thinking about the customer, not the technology. Okay, so the other thing that's important is understanding how we're going to shift the behaviors for a digital culture. And there's three key points that we need to consider here. First and foremost, you cannot ignore culture. It actually puts the whole transformation at risk and it won't be successful. Like I said earlier, if you don't get this right, no matter what you do with your technology and your operating model, they will fail. And the other thing is to understand that this digital culture empowers the people to deliver those results faster and also attracts the talent. Now, we already know that companies that do focus on culture in their transformation are 5 times more likely to deliver a stronger performance than companies that don't. And so, when you go through that process, think about the change that is required, activate the leadership and engage with the employees, and then align that to the organization when you embed those cultures. Okay. Finally, I just want to talk about what is the board's responsibility in all of this. And I think this is really important. And in fact, I could probably speak hours about this alone. So let's think about what is the board's responsibility. And it's usually in 5 specific categories. Compensation policy, how they reward the key personnel and the executives, how they actually appoint the executives and the succession of those executives. They provide financial oversight, risk oversight, and strategic oversight for the organization. So if we think about how this works in a traditional organization and a traditional board, when it comes to compensation policy, it's quite short term. They think about providing bonuses in the current year for results in the current year. We don't think beyond that about how do we grow the organization. Well, the focus certainly is in that on a much more long-term vision. The executives, there's not a high need or desire to have technical capabilities in those executives or a CEO. Now, we're seeing trends changing here, but this is really important to understand that many executives still don't have that technical capability. When they think about the financial aspects of the business, it's the operational cost versus the capitalized cost to develop and deliver assets. When we think about the risk side of it, they're constantly telling us not to fail, but from a strategic perspective, they're telling us to innovate. So where would we like this shift to go? Well, first of all, we need to think about the compensation policy, not to be focusing on providing bonuses to our key personnel, but how do we just get the key personnel in there with fewer higher paid staff that are going to be accountable and have the skill sets to deliver the outcome of the business. And technical skills must be mandatory for a CEO, must have some kind of background to understand how this ecosystem of technology and digital are going to come together. And when we think about the financial aspects of the business, we need to think about how do we invest in horizons and make incremental spend. So consciously understand that we are investing for this year, but consciously understand that we are investing for subsequent years with the growth of the organization. And again, when we think about the risk oversight, let's not create big monolithic projects. We want smaller projects with smaller changes. And when it comes to innovation, just get out of the way of innovation. You've put that team in place, you're rewarding them accordingly, and you've given them the financial and risk boundaries to do that within. Let them get on with it. That's it for me. I love this quote. This is from one of my favorite movies of all time, Lawrence of Arabia, and I think it truly describes, what I like to motivate my people with, and that is that it's all about innovation and dreaming. So all men dream, but not equally. Those who dream by night in the dusty recesses of their minds wake in the day to find that it was vanity. But the dreamers of the day are dangerous men, for they may act on their dreams with open eyes to make them possible. Thank you for your time today.